Hey everybody, you all having a good GDC thus far? Awesome, thank you ever so much for sticking around to the end to see my little presentation. That's super good of you. I've been authorized by the event coordinators to warn you that they've given me this laser device to blind anyone whose mobile phone goes off. So if you could please turn your phones off. Also, you'll probably be receiving an email requesting feedback on this presentation. Please feel free to fill that in. I'd love to hear what you think, unless you think it's bad, in which case I wouldn't. And so with that out of the way, I shall begin my presentation. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Taylor. I've been in the video game industry in various capacities for over 15 years now. And I've had the awesome privilege to work at great studios like Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, Electronic Arts in Vancouver, Rockstar, and Ubisoft. And I'm currently working as a senior level designer for Square Enix at their studio in Montreal, which is a place that's famous for lumberjacks, poutine, and this lady, Celine Dion, who I think is the mayor or the queen of Montreal or something. It's also where the new HITMAN is being made. And I've been tasked with running the level design on that, which is super, super exciting. And when I found out I was working on such a revered franchise, I was reminded of the graphic novelist Paul Pope and what he said when he was given carte blanche to do whatever he wanted with Batman. He said that working on such a cool franchise was like being handed the keys to an extremely hot car. Now, you can either drive it very carefully, make sure you don't scratch the paint, or you can take it out onto the highway and open it up and see what it can do. And I figured that if I was going to take Hitman out onto the highway, it'd be good if I had some kind of map so I didn't get lost and I knew where I was going. And it just so happened that before I landed at Square, I was putting together a series of best practices for next-gen level design, which was kind of helpful. And I found myself looking to classic design principles for inspiration, as I often do in situations like this, particularly the work of this guy, Dieter Rams. So for those of you who don't know Dieter Rams, he was the chief design officer at Braun in Germany for over 30 years. His product design has been a major influence on people like Jonathan Ive, who does all the product design for Apple. And in the 1970s, he published a paper called 10 Principles of Good Design. So good design is honest. Good design is aesthetic. Good design is as little design as possible, and so on and so forth. And whilst this works well for minimalist product design, it's not really applicable to game design or level design. But I thought it might be possible to do a similar set of guidelines for level design. So I started to put them together. Before I get going, I'm going to make a quick apology. There's going to be a lot of interdisciplinary crossover in these principles. So it's more than just level design. It's mission design, it's narrative design, it's mechanic design. And I think this is important because a good level designer should really be well-versed in all of these fields so they can take a holistic approach to the design of their levels. Also, despite Charlton Heston dressed as Moses in these slides, these are not rules that are written in stone. They're just guiding principles. They're my undereducated opinion. They've been created to prompt discussion, to shed a little bit of light on the black art of level design, and to hopefully help some people create some kick-ass levels along the way. So now we've got that out of the way, let's start with the first principle, which is that good level design is fun to navigate. Now, just traversing a level presents the player with many different gameplay vectors. There's observational, which is the act of surveying one's surroundings. Strategic, the act of processing your observations into a plan. And then there's navigational, the act of actually traversing the level itself. And for a smooth and enjoyable experience, the player should always know exactly where to go, which is why it's important to develop a consistent visual language that clearly guides the player through the critical path. Now, different games use different methods to do this, but it usually comes down to the use of light, geometry, color, and animation. A good example of which is Mirror's Edge. So Mirror's Edge uses all of these things to create fantastic clarity and flow. If you look at this slide, it's pretty easy to work out that you have to climb up the red crane, run along the red crane, jump onto the red pipes, run along the red pipes, and then jump onto the conveniently placed soft, squishy object just on the right. But the important thing to note here is the difference between intuitive to navigate and fun to navigate. What the player doesn't notice in the screenshot is equally important. So the hidden messenger bags, the speed paths that will give you achievements, and all of these are put in there to encourage exploration, which is essentially freestyle navigation. And this helps create depth and replayability in your levels. Also, in contrast to this point, sometimes it's good to throw in a little confusion. Now, Modern Warfare 2 does this particularly well in its favela level. It's highly memorable for its hectic and intense gameplay. It's set in a Brazilian favela. It's a tight, twisty maze. There's no clearly obvious path through it. Enemies are coming from all sides. They're coming from behind. They bring verticality into the level design with enemies attacking you from above. Is it easy to navigate through this level? Absolutely not. Is it fun? Yes, it is. And by carefully throwing in some well-considered confusion to the mix, Treyarch have created a really good sense of dramatic tension in this level. And speaking of drama, the second principle is that good level design does not rely on words to tell the story. One of my mentors once told me that a good story or a good piece of communication is like a broken circle. And you give the player this circle, and it's down to them to fill in the gap. Now, the trick here is if you make the gap too big, the player won't be able to fill it in, and he'll feel confused and patronized. But if you make the gap too small, he'll fill it in too easily, and he'll be bored, and he won't feel challenged. So how do we do this in terms of level design? Well, there are three types of narrative at work in a game's level. There's explicit, implicit, and emergent. Explicit narrative is anything that's explicitly called out to the player through cutscenes or text or spoken dialogue or any written, written content that he or she finds. And it's this that creates your circle. Implicit is anything that the player figures out for themselves by looking at the environment, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail in a second. And emergent is the story that the player makes up in his or her own head. Now, creating the first type of narrative is pretty straightforward, but it's the other two types, implicit and emergent, that create that crucial gap in the circle. So how do we do this in a level? Well, the best way of creating implicit narrative is a technique called mise-en-scène, which has been used by stage and cinema for many, many years, and it's the art of telling the story through the environment. And I believe that some studios call this environmental narrative. So for me, the master of implicit narrative is BioShock. So if you look at these pictures here, you'll see there's water on the floor, which is kind of bad if you're in an underwater city. There are balloons on the ceiling, which means there was a party recently. There are creepy masks, which make you think, what kind of party was this? And there are drinks that have been left abandoned, so clearly something went wrong and people left in a hurry. What I find particularly interesting about this picture is the massive big sign on the side, which clearly says that it's New Year 1959, which tells you the exact date that everything went wrong. But also, even though it's almost the 60s, the decor of this environment is very much in the 40s, which creates an odd visual disparity and makes the player feel uneasy. Now, it's very important that you should design your levels to give your world artists the opportunity to tell this visual story. But creating emergent narrative is not such an obvious task, because the level designer doesn't actually create it. He merely enables it by providing the player with choice. So HITMAN is actually a great example of emergent narrative, as there's plenty of choice. So you can use any kind of game mechanic you like to kill your mark. You can poison him with a syringe, or you can poison their food. You can use combat mechanics, either garroting him with a fiber wire, or filling him full of bullets. You can even use the physics to kill him by pushing him off a ledge or by pushing something heavy onto him. And this is freedom of choice, an emergent style that's great for allowing the player to fill in the gap in your circle. In fact, in Hitman, you can even go in dressed as a chicken, guns blazing, and kill absolutely everyone in the entire level. Or you can sneak through the level undetected, dressed in your immaculate black suit, kill only the mark, and leave through the front door before anyone knows you're there, getting that perfect silent assassin rating, which is great. But too much choice can leave the player confused and in need of guidance, which is why the third principle is that good level design always tells the player what to do, but never how to do it. The player needs to be in no doubt as to what he or she has to do when they go through your level. And you should provide them with clear objectives, so waypoints, other navigational aids, etc. But it is possible to create compelling challenge through obfuscation of the details. That is to say, by providing nebulous objectives. So keep your guidance concise and clear. Only give as much information to the player as is absolutely necessary, but make sure you provide multiple paths and styles of approach. So Skyrim does this very well because of its open world nature, particularly the Dark Brotherhood missions, which are kind of like a Tolkien-esque Hitman. They tell you exactly where you can find your mark and exactly who they are. They even appear as a mark on your compass. But it never forces the player to use a singular technique to carry out the execution. In fact, if you look at the level design for the Dark Brotherhood missions, very often specific alternate methods of execution have been set up. So there'll be an arrow, a bow rather, and a sheath of arrows on top of a ledge so you can strike from a distance, or there'll be an opportunity to kill the target silently when they leave the crowd and go to a secluded spot. So as well as not forcing the player what to do, it's important not to punish the player for improvisation. If the player does something that you don't expect, you shouldn't chastise them. You should design it into your game and encourage player improvisation. And all this ties in with the emergent narrative that I was talking about earlier. So veteran game designer Mark Cerny tells us that the player should be presented with concurrent objectives that can be completed in any order he or she wishes. Furthermore, on completion of one of those objectives, the player should receive a reward which either makes the other objectives easier or modifies them in some way. And you can see this at work in Ratchet & Clank, on which Cerny consulted, whereby if you complete the first planet, 3 or 4 planets become opened up to you, and you can complete them in any way that you like. Once you've completed one of the planets, you get a new cool gadget or a weapon that lets you open up new and alternate paths on the other planets. And it's this constant flow of gadgets that keeps the player engaged as he learns to use them, which is why good level design constantly teaches the player something new. Now, previously, when I rehearsed this presentation, this is the spot where I do my Yoda impersonation to keep everyone awake. But it always goes down like an absolute lead balloon, so I'm going to spare you my bad Yoda. And instead, I'm going to tell you about a book called The Theory of Fun by Rafe Koster. In this book, Rafe Koster says that the human mind enjoys processing patterns for storage and retrieval later. And a lot of the fun in playing games is derived from this pattern analysis. If this pattern analysis ends too soon, this processing stops and the enjoyment ends. So how do we prolong this enjoyment through good level design? Well, each level in your game should introduce, showcase, or subvert a key mechanic. Now, again, holistic design of all of the levels in your game is important for this to work because you have to pace it out throughout the entire game. The best example of this constant teaching is any game in the Zelda series. So when you get into a new dungeon in any Zelda game, you pick up a new piece of equipment. And each room in the dungeon teaches you a different way to use that piece of equipment. Then the final boss in that dungeon tests your mastery of the piece of equipment before it even lets you out of the dungeon. On top of that, when you get out into the open world, you're constantly asked to learn new ways of using your equipment to access hidden areas and find all of those heart containers and large rupee chests and so on and so forth. But it doesn't stop there. Even the game's final boss usually requires the player to use every single bit of equipment in an unusual way. And this is quite similar to the loop that Bethesda used to pace their games, which is learn, play, challenge, surprise. They'll teach the mechanic to the player explicitly. Then they'll provide a safe area with no threat and all of the toys that the player needs to kind of muck around and play with the mechanic. Then they'll bring in some threat or a compelling objective to challenge the player's mastery of that mechanic. And then just when the player is feeling comfortable, they'll do something crazy to surprise him. And this is why the next principle is that good level design is surprising. Now, this may seem pretty obvious, but a lot of designers forget about this. And by surprising, I don't mean that you should just fill your level with loads of monsters jumping out of closets. What I'm trying to say is that you need to keep everything fresh by not falling into a routine. Now, I'm sure all of you are super familiar with the classic roller coaster pacing method, which is used to pace pretty much everything in video games. So you have steadily increasing crescendos of intensity, punctuated by troughs of slightly lower intensity so as not to desensitize the player. And this pattern is repeated throughout all the levels and throughout all the mechanics in most games, almost to a fractal level. And it's my belief that if you do this in a game, it becomes predictable pretty fast. So Alex Mandryka, who was formerly the creative director at Relic, wrote a paper on Gamer Sutra in which he explained that fun is actually created through uncertainty. And by constantly flipping the player in and out of his comfort zone, you can create quite a lot of fun. And the best way to do this is to be subversive, to take an existing game design paradigm, like the aforementioned pacing, and flip it. My favorite example of this is the Ishimura level in Dead Space 2. Has everyone here played Dead Space 2? Wow, a surprise. Not as many people as I thought. That's upsetting, because Dead Space 2 is ace. Is anyone here going to play Dead Space 2? Because I'm about to spoil the Ishimura level. Well, that's a shame. Anyway, so when you get to the Ishimura in Dead Space 2, the Ishimura is the spaceship from Dead Space 1. You've been fighting necromorphs all the way through the game. And you get to the Ishimura and you think, ooh, this is the spaceship from Dead Space 1. This is going to be full of nasty aliens. And you get in, nothing. You're like, oh, OK, that's a bit strange. 5 minutes later into the level, you think, OK, right, bring on the aliens. Nothing. 10 minutes into the level, you're like, shit, where are the aliens? Still no aliens. And it's not until 15 minutes into the Ishimura level, when you reach the spaceship's central transport corridor, that this massive, great big monster drops from the ceiling, and at this point, you're ready to wet yourself, figuratively speaking, obviously. And this is quite cool, so they've disrupted this pacing. I'm quite lucky to know the producer on that level, and when I found out that he was responsible, I was really excited. I was like, Matt, how did you work out this paradigm shift? It's brilliant. Did you watch a lot of horror movies? Did you take a course on horror writing? Did you do loads of tests and do psychometric analysis? How did you do it? And he goes, well, no, we didn't really have any choice because we didn't have time to build any new level geometry, so we had to reuse the old Ishimura. And we weren't allowed to change it because that would mess with the canon. And the game director was very insistent that we showcase this massive big monster, and he wouldn't let us use any other monsters as the first encounter in the level. So we didn't have a choice. And this kind of worked out quite well, because this restrictive design has really forced my friend to take a big risk with the pacing. And taking risks is important if you want to stand out. Now, it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about taking risks. I see, now it's working. It's important for me, it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about taking risks, but we all know that the problem with risks is that they are inherently risky. It's the designer's responsibility to manage this risk sensibly. So design your levels diligently on paper, but don't forget that what looks good on paper doesn't always work once you get it into the game. And oddly enough, the reverse of this is true. Sometimes some really ridiculous ideas actually work very well when you test them in game. It's absolutely crucial that if you've got anything risky, you grey box it and test it as soon as possible. Otherwise, you'll risk getting it cut as your game hurtles toward its next milestone, and your producer's looking at this crazy idea and thinking, that's a bit risky, I'm going to cut it. So on Medal of Honor, we designed these awesome little kind of grenade puzzles where you could access hidden areas of the level by chucking grenades down vents and flushing Nazis out of otherwise impregnable bunkers. Unfortunately, very late in production, we hadn't proved it out. It wasn't quite working. It ended up getting cut just because we hadn't tested it enough, or we hadn't tested it early enough. And this was a big shame because it would have really helped towards the feeling of player empowerment. And this is my favorite slide. The next principle is that good level design empowers the player. The 18th century poet, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and for those of you that were born after 1985, that's him in the picture. Goethe said that you should dream no small dreams, for they have no power to move the hearts of men. And I think this is the 18th century equivalent of the phrase, go big or go home. And as a level designer, you should definitely do this. You should eschew the mundane. You should never give your player shopping list and missions, because essentially video games are escapism. And why would people want to escape to somewhere that they could go in real life? Because quite frankly, real life sucks. Has anyone here seen the TV show Charlie Brooker's Games Wipe? Wow, almost as many people who have played Dead Space 2. Well, you should see this. It's actually the most entertaining piece of TV ever made about video games, in my opinion, anyway. And it's on YouTube. But anyway, in this TV show, the Irish comedian Dara O'Brien explains why he's never got to the third island in GTA 4. Because there's this mission where he has to drive all the way across town in rush hour traffic. And he has to drive carefully so as not to upset the police. And then he has to go through a toll bridge. He even has to pay the toll, and he has to drive carefully through the gates and not crash. He can't speed through, otherwise he'll upset the police. And if he gets caught by the police, he gets arrested, and he has to go right back to the start and do it again. And he was playing this one afternoon, and he thought, hang on a second, I can drive in rush hour traffic in real life. What am I doing playing this video game? So he just stopped, and he's never got to the last island on GTA. In most games, players want to be badasses. And a title that does this really well is Red Faction Guerrilla. And it really delivers the fantasy of being a Martian rebel. It doesn't give you a mission to drive across a toll bridge. It gives you a mission to destroy a toll bridge using a sniper rifle that vaporizes metal. Now, this is super, super empowering, as it lets the player see his effect on the environment straight away. And the key gameplay mechanic in Red Faction really helps this, the destructible terrain. So this is kind of an unfair example. But whilst this mechanic does help, you don't need such an obvious mechanic to do this in your levels if you design them to show the player's influence. I like the way that Infamous does this. So many missions in Infamous necessitate a karmic choice of some sort. You can either be good or you can be evil when you complete the mission. And in fact, this karma system is proliferated throughout the entire open world environment. For example, there are bombs throughout the town, which you can either defuse to save people, or you can let them explode and absorb their power and become stronger, but there's resultant collateral damage. Now, a karma system isn't particularly special in a game. There are lots of games that do it. But what Infamous does really well is the subtle ways in which it shows the consequence of your karmic choices. So, for example, the citizens of the city, if you take good karmic choices, the better you become, the more they'll help you. So they'll start cheering when you walk past, or they'll start throwing rocks at the bad guys you're trying to fight. And conversely, if you're evil, they'll start booing you in a kind of pantomime style, and then they'll start throwing rocks at you, which is a kind of nice little way of showing the player that his actions do have a consequence. In Medal of Honor, we put Allied hostages in some of the levels that you could rescue. And if you rescue these hostages, they'd pop up later on in the level to help you out. So depending on how you played some of the levels, if you were a little more daring, they'd be a little easier later on. Which leads me to the next principle, that good level design is easy, medium, and hard. Now, what on earth does this mean? How can a level be easy, medium, and hard? Well, I've got to confess that I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet, or an axe to grind, or what have you, with the standard difficulty select screen that you see in a lot of video games. I think it's archaic. It asks the player to make an arbitrary choice which will affect how the entire game handles for him or her, with no knowledge of how his skill stacks up against the game mechanics. Why can't the player choose in game simply by playing the game? I'm, of course, alluding to the use of risk-reward. So this works in terms of level design by designing multiple pathways through your level. So you always design the basic path through your level to present an easy to medium challenge. And then you have clearly called out high-risk paths with an obvious reward, or conversely, easier paths if your main path starts to get a little tough. And it's important when you do this to use the visual language that I mentioned in the first principle. And the king of risk-reward in games is burnout. Now, in burnout, on the tracks, there are always narrow shortcuts. They're clearly more risky because they're narrow. They're always called out by a bright yellow barricade, which is their visual language. And they always provide a really obvious reduction in your lap time or some sweet air so you can get some boost. There's no difficulty select screen in Burnout because the players can select their own difficulty dynamically. And this isn't just applicable to racing games. You can use a multi-layered approach in RPGs, action-adventures, first-person shooters. You can place a powerful weapon in a tricky-to-reach spot, necessitating navigational risk. You can place a dangerous enemy with a clearly called-out flanking route, allowing people who are skilled in stealth an opportunity to reduce the risk. These side paths can also be a puzzle requiring a little more cerebral skill to access. For an example, an object that can be seen, but the route to that object is hidden, or secret areas that are called out with a visual cue. I still have a slight problem with flickering neon lights. Every time I'm near one, I feel compelled to look for secret doors because I played too much Doom when I was at university. So games like Dishonored use this layered approach to good effect. They fill the level with multiple paths for various styles and various aptitudes of player. And these multiple gameplay layers also extend the replayability of their levels, which makes for efficient design. And good level design is efficient. Now, this is classic Dieter Rams. A video game always has a very finite amount of resources, whether that's the technical limitations of the hardware that you're developing on, such as the memory or the pixel pushing power, to the real-world constraints, like your production schedule, the number of people on your team, the scope of your project, and so on. And it's a designer's responsibility to maximize the use of those resources. And for level design, this means not only using the whole animal nose to tail, but doing it more than once and doing it quickly. For this, modular design is your friend. A good level designer doesn't create a level. He creates a series of modular mechanic-driven encounters that you can string together to make a level, and another level, and another level. On top of this, this technique also creates a series of familiar moments that the player can use to learn and master your mechanics. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to check out the toolkits that ship with the Bethesda games, but these are extremely modular. They're essentially like medieval Lego or post-apocalyptic Lego, depending on which game you're playing with. And it's through this modularity that such a relatively small team can create such a massive amount of content. And also by applying simple modifiers to these modules, it's possible to create variation and keep things fresh by providing increased challenge and surprise. Modifiers are particularly important for creating bi-directional gameplay. Now, your level artists, or your world artists, are going to spend a lot of time making the levels that you design look beautiful, when the unfortunate reality is that most players will blitz through them in a matter of seconds. Now, how do you keep your level artists happy and get the most bang for your art buck? Well, you need to reuse the nice artwork from your level. Now, the most obvious way to do this is to make your player backtrack a lot. But backtracking is totally not cool. What you should do instead is design for bidirectional gameplay. So what I mean by that is gameplay on the way there is totally different to gameplay on the way back. And a game series that does this very well is Halo. So for example, in Halo 1, the level 343 Guilty Spark is awesome for bidirectionality. It begins as a search mission with exploratory gameplay. And then when you unleash the flood, all hell breaks loose and it's intense combat on the way back. Similarly, in Halo 3, in the mission The Ark, you fight through a desert level on foot using a sniper rifle, and then when you get to the mission to Apex, you get a tank airdropped in, and you can blast your way out of the level in a tank. Totally, totally different gameplay. Expanding on this principle further, levels, and in fact the entire game, can be made totally non-linear. A great way of doing this is to provide implicit objectives that require intuition and exploration to complete. So the skulls in Halo, the cog tags in Gears of War, and the feathers in Assassin's Creed. These are all designed to encourage non-linear exploration and extend the gameplay with no extra hit to production. But these are actually not great examples of non-linear gameplay because it's very important that you don't create gameplay for gameplay's sake, just to pad out your game. You need to keep your non-linearity relevant by incentivizing the player, by calling out clearly the reward in advance. The heart in Dishonored is a great example of this. In fact, you should also try and tie these objectives into the main narrative thread. There's this awesome old Game Boy Advance game called Astro Boy Omega Factor that does this beautifully by actually replaying the levels a key narrative element. Once you've finished the game and played through all the levels, you're treated to really quite a disappointing ending. But somebody appears and sends Astro Boy all the way back in time to the start of the game with all of the power-ups and weapons that he's collected. He can then play through the game, zapping backwards and forwards in time, using all of his different power-ups to select the levels, defeat monsters that he couldn't defeat before, open up secret areas, and ultimately get the much more rewarding true conclusion to the game. So essentially, what this plot device does is massage the player into playing through the entire game twice, which is pretty cool because when you do complete it, the finale is really emotional. Which is why rule number 9 is that good level design creates emotion. Last year, the US Supreme Court, there they are, bless their little cotton socks, declared that video games were legally art, which is ace. According to the dictionary, art is the quality, production, expression, or realm, according to aesthetic principles, of what is beautiful, appealing, or of more than ordinary significance. Now, this is a kind of dry, pragmatic definition of art for me. From a purely subjective and personal standpoint, I like to think of art as anything that's been specifically created to provoke an emotional reaction. So paintings, sculpture, photography, music, movies, all of these are created to encourage some kind of emotional response in their recipient. This is particularly true for an interactive medium like video games. Now, the most analogous form of art to level design is, surprise, surprise, architecture. And architects have been playing with people's emotions for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there are loads of great architectural theories that we can steal from them. For example, windows. If windows are placed below knee height, that's because the architect wanted to convey the feeling of power and voyeurism. Conversely, if windows are placed above shoulder height, the architect wanted to invoke a feeling of persecution and imprisonment, although I'm not entirely sure why an architect would want to do that unless he was designing a prison. Architects make curved rooms with no corners to induce a feeling of womb-like calm in their buildings. There are also a lot of classic level design tricks that you can use to create spatial empathy. You can use tight corners to limit the player's field of view, to keep him tense and suspicious and claustrophobic. You can make your level twisty and labyrinthian to create confusion and panic. Alternatively, you can blow that space wide open to create a feeling of isolation and epic scale. Even switching from narrow space to a large space is a great technique to force the player to look at a specific vista to create a sense of wonder. You can bring verticality into the mix to create a feeling of persecution by attacking the player from above, a feeling of vertigo by making the player scale a high mountain or a high building, or a feeling of hope by placing a reward at the top of a tall building. The new Tomb Raider does this really well. It goes from super narrow caves to wide open jungle and really leverages the space or lack thereof to create emotion. And aside from spatial empathy, when designing for emotion, I personally find that the best technique is to work backwards. So your starting point should be the desired emotional response that you want to evoke from the player. Then you should drill down and select the spatial parameters, the narrative elements and mechanics that you want to use to elicit that emotion. So if you want to make the player feel persecuted, put an enemy AI into your level that constantly hunts him. If you want the player to feel exhilarated, engage them in a high-speed chase or a firefight in a large open space or an open road. If you want the player to feel a sense of urgency, modify your core mechanics with some kind of time limit. If you want the player to feel a sense of desperation, give them an almost impossible goal and then save them at the last minute, like Company of Heroes does in the Carentan mission. Now, this is an interesting mission for me because in this level of Company of Heroes, you're asked to protect the town of Carentan against a Nazi invasion force until Allied reinforcements arrive. And so if you guys thought the same thing that I did when I was given that mission objective, I thought, that's cool. All I have to do is hold out for a certain amount of time, and then my reinforcements will arrive. But Company of Heroes effectively lies to the player about the mission parameters, because the reinforcements aren't triggered by a timer. They're triggered by the number of soldiers you have left alive. So they will only ever appear when you have 2 soldiers left. Now, this makes this battle super, super intense. And in fact, using the game mechanics like this to create emotion is possibly the single most important goal of a level designer, which is why the final principle is that good level design is driven by mechanics. Now, I read this quote somewhere on the internet, and apologies to whoever I'm stealing it from because I couldn't find it again, and I don't know who said it. But the quote goes that books let you imagine extraordinary things. Movies let you see extraordinary things. But video games let you actually do extraordinary things. And so, above all else, great level design is driven by this interaction, the game's mechanics. Game levels don't just provide the context or the setting for the mechanics, they provide the very reality in which they exist. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance for this next slide and for the slightly highfalutin word smithery, but I like to describe a game's level as the metaphysical medium through which the gameplay is delivered. So I'm going to expand on this by means of an analogy, and I like to think of your video game as a painting. So the subject of your painting, what you're painting, those are your gameplay mechanics. That's your gameplay mechanics. The composition, what gives your subject its context, that's your narrative and your graphics. The medium, the actual oil and canvas that you paint your painting with, is your game's level. Your level should be a gameplay delivery system whose primary function is to leverage your mechanics to create a great experience. Topology, architecture, objectives, interactions, combat scenarios, etc. should all be designed to showcase your game's mechanics. Now, it's important to have a thorough understanding of your mechanics in order to do this, but I appreciate that this isn't always possible as your mechanics and your levels are being developed concurrently. But you should always have a rough idea of the sort of systems that are being built. Conversely, this can work the other way around. If there's something that you want that's cool in your level, talk to your lead mechanic engineer or your lead gameplay designer to see if you can get a mechanic to support it. In fact, interdisciplinary communication between engineers, designers, and artists is absolutely crucial if you want to have a strong level design team. My favorite game for, well, one of my favorite games for mechanic-based design is Deus Ex Human Revolution. So the levels in Deus Ex, they have multiple paths that showcase the stealth mechanics and the combat mechanics. They have specific moments for the player to use their augments. So areas where you can use your bionic arms to punch through walls, your reinforced back to lift up heavy objects and reveal new paths through the level. Unsuspecting enemies who are standing at the bottom of a really tall building, so you can use your Icarus drop to wipe them out in a really flashy way. Even the secondary missions have been designed to leverage the mechanics. So my favorite one is a mission where you have to stun somebody and then drag their body over a balcony to make it look like a suicide. And this highlights the non-lethal takedowns, the body dragging mechanic, and the ragdoll physics. This particular mission is a really good example of creative reuse of the game's mechanics. Now, when you start to showcase your mechanics, it's important that you don't just rinse and repeat the same little setup over and over again. You need to find creative ways to modify these mechanics and keep them fresh. The Riddler challenges in Batman Arkham City are a really good example of this, where the player has to use his equipment in clever new ways to unlock puzzles. This is cool because it extends the playtime and keeps the player learning. And the resultant cerebral gameplay fuels the fantasy of being the world's greatest detective, rather than just a man in a cape who's great at kicking ass. So, that's the 10th principle. For any of you who have fallen asleep during this presentation, this is a good time to wake up, because I'm about to recap and go through the entire 10 rules in one slide. But first, I'm going to take some water. So, there it is again. Good level design is fun to navigate. Create a clear visual language, but feel free to throw in some chaos. Good level design does not rely on words to tell a story. Use implicit and emergent narrative rather than explicit. Good level design tells the player what to do, but not how to do it. Use clearly communicated objectives that players can complete in any way or order they want. Good level design constantly teaches the player something new. It keeps the player engaged by continuously introducing or subverting new mechanics. Good level design is surprising. Don't be afraid to take risks with the pacing, aesthetics, or any other elements. Good level design empowers the player. Video games are escapism. Let the player feel the impact of his actions. Good level design is easy, medium, and hard. Use risk-reward so that the player can set the difficulty dynamically. Good level design is efficient, designed for modularity, bi-directionality, and non-linearity, and lots of other arities. Good level design creates emotion. It begins at the end with the desired emotional response and works backwards to select the appropriate mechanics to elicit that response. And good level design is driven by the game's mechanics. Above all, it showcases the game's mechanics through the medium of the level to reinforce the uniquely interactive nature of video games. And those are the 10 principles of good level design. Woo. If anyone's got any questions, I would be happy to answer them, as long as they're not too hard. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for the talk.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering if instead we want to switch the end to good level design is written by emotion and fueled by the mechanics. I mean, if we look at the runaway hit of Journey that just happened, it's about the motion there. It's what emotion is elicited through the game in the player. And the mechanics are all there to not empower, but to help underline that emotion. Like the mountain level, that it wasn't about making you feel great. It was about making you feel horrible.
So just to make sure I understand, your question is that it should be more about an emotional reaction than the empowerment?
I'm thinking that if we focus on the emotions that are coming through the player or we're trying to put into the level, instead of focusing on the mechanics, then the mechanics will fall into place and we'll have much more emotional experiences. I just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I think, okay, so focusing on the emotions rather than the mechanics. So switching rules 9 and 10, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you can totally do that. In fact, it's kind of an odd order. I tried really hard not to give these, to list these in order of priority, even though I put what I thought was the most important one at the end. But you can weight them however you like. I think if you're designing your levels to showcase mechanics and you're picking the mechanics to drive the emotion, you're kind of doing that already, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just worried about putting too much of a focus on empowerment makes us tell a very certain type of story.
Yes, yeah. So I actually I put these together before I'd played Journey, which, to my disgrace, I only played it a couple of weeks ago, and it was awesome, which was great. And I was sitting through the Journey presentation, which was also great yesterday. Was it yesterday? And I just thought, ooh, all my level design presentation is kind of all about like, going in guns blazing and empowerment and what my friend's wife likes to call the most important boy in the universe syndrome, where she thinks that most people play video games so they can feel like the most important boy in the universe. But I think you could certainly twist, not twist, but repurpose the empowerment principle to make the empowerment about being emotionally empowered. So being able to feel really sad, or it's more about really delivering on the fantasy that you want the player to feel, which doesn't necessarily have to be about being He-Man or being big and powerful.
Yeah, maybe we want something more about an emotional intelligence instead of just empowerment, but just something to think about.
No, that's awesome.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just wondering how those commandments apply to the multiplayer aspect of levels.
Ooh, interesting. Not sure. I kind of wrote those from a single-player perspective in mind, but I would have to give that a little more thought. I'm going to defer that one and answer you by email. If you want to ping me an email, I'll have a think about it and get back to you.
Right, will do.
Hi, great talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
My question is based on a couple of your rules. To me, seem to really encourage the player to take the time to figure out how to do things on their own.
Yes.
And the downside to that is obviously that the longer the player is working at that, the higher their level of frustration is climbing. Mm-hmm. I was wondering how you approach actually creating player frustration to enable them to actually, discover new mechanics on their own instead of having text on screen to direct them.
I think it's very important to trust the player to work out your mechanics. There's this constant kind of balancing act you have to do between the amount of work and effort you put into a certain part of your level design and the percentage chance that the player is going to work it out. Different studios have very different approaches to this. I remember on Medal of Honor, a lot of the secondary objectives, which I put in to make the level feel more fleshed out and more interesting, were actually turned into primary objectives because the gameplay director thought they were too cool to leave as secondary objectives, which was kind of odd for me. It was like, no, they're not too cool, which is kind of strange. Yeah, does that answer your question at all?
It does. It does.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. Yeah, it's a matter of trust and balancing. There's no easy, quick answer for that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
So I had a quick question about what you were talking about with efficiency specifically.
Okay.
You mentioned that you think that bi-directional levels are a very good idea, and I definitely agree. But back when I was playing games such as like Halo 1, back in the day, All my friends my Half-Life playing friends, I was too poor to have a good PC. My Half-Life playing friends, they would say things like, oh, well, why would you play a game with so much copy and paste level design? So I was wondering, like, what is a good way to make sure you don't make the players feel like it's too repetitious if you're playing backwards in a level, even if the gameplay is different?
I think there are a couple of ways you can do this, actually. So in terms of the gameplay, I've discussed using a modifier to change the gameplay on the way back. You can also do stuff with the lighting and the geometry so that it looks totally different depending on which direction you're approaching it from. You can do subtle little things to make it all feel differently. I think Halo is possibly a dangerous example to talk about because there are some parts of the game which are beautifully bidirectional, and there are other parts of the game where it's like, oh, you're making me walk through the same copy-pasted level again and again and again. And I think one of the important things to remember between Halo and Half-Life is the fact that Half-Life took 7 years to make, I think, or something like that. So they probably had plenty of time to make lots of nice levels.
Thank you.
Hello. About your bit on dynamic difficulty.
Yes.
You brought in the fact that some games will hide special weapons or all sorts of little secrets for the player who wants to take the challenge further and search around. These players who are more willing to face more difficult challenges are most of the time rewarded with a weapon or an item that makes the game easier for them. How do you keep that balance without just making the game easier for those who have worked harder on it?
I think you need to be cognizant of that when you design the reward for the risk. So, for example, if you put a big weapon in a game, you need to make sure there's a reason for that to be used. And if you want to put in an extra bit of risk-reward, it's important to balance it so that it doesn't break the overall difficulty curve. And if you want to be really, really advanced to kind of fix, like to patch a problem, if you can dynamically up the, not the ferocity, but let's say the level of the combatants that the player will face if he collects the rocket launcher, say, for example.
Thank you.
I've completely failed to repeat people's questions. I do apologize for that. I'll try and do that with this one.
Hi. Yeah. As the years go by, I've noticed that obviously games have been reaching a wider variety of audiences. And I have some friends that they are not really gamers, and they have started to play games, like the recent games. And a lot of them get lost a lot in environments. They don't know like where to go. They don't know what to do sometimes. And for me, it seems completely intuitive. And people that do play games for years, they notice they do. So I think maybe some people, it's harder for them to understand maybe what to do in certain types of level design. Do you think that because of this, and since games are becoming like so big and lots more people are playing them, is level design changing the way, like are level designers working to make a different, to be easier for more people to understand what's going on? Or is it just like people just need to adapt? I don't know. Do you think that is happening? Is that an issue?
That's an interesting question. So if I understand correctly, you're asking me if level design is being dumbed down to accommodate a broader audience of players who aren't necessarily familiar with the visual tropes to guide people through levels. I think it is to a certain extent, but it depends on the type of game you're playing. I mean, a good example of this is the first BioShock, which had that little compass, which would always point you exactly where in the direction you're supposed to go. And the first thing I did was turn it off because it was annoying. But I imagine it was probably quite helpful for a lot of players who weren't familiar with navigating a 3D space. When we put Medal of Honor together, the navigability of the levels was a really big problem. We had signposts that pointed you in the right direction. We had, you always had to go towards red objects. You had compass markers. You had a little compass which would always point you in the direction you had to go. You had a big arrow on the screen that told you where to go. The soldiers would lead you through the level, so they'd always kind of leapfrog over you to guide you through the level. People still didn't know where to go. So it's quite a complex problem. And aside from doing the Dead Space or Perfect Dark trick of actually pinging on the floor and showing the player exactly where to go, there's no way that you can really explicitly direct the player somewhere without breaking some of the immersion, I think.
Okay.
So that's, again, it's about finding a balance. That's not really a great answer, but hopefully that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
A common problem that I see in game design is whenever you're about to battle a boss.
Yeah. I thought, he's talking without moving his lips. That's brilliant.
Sorry. But whenever I'm about to fight a boss, you mentioned the surprise element in level design.
Yeah.
But I find that I always know a boss is coming because I enter a room that's just full of ammunition. And I imagine that you have to combat that because, like, I'm the kind of guy that's going to just burn through my grenades. Yeah. And then I find the boss, I'm like, crap, I should have saved the grenades. And so you're kind of combating against numbskulls, but also destroying that surprise element. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's interesting. I think what you've got there is what I like to refer to as the designer's curse. So you're so familiar with the mechanics and the setup of the levels and level design that you know exactly what's coming. You can preempt it. I have this problem when I'm playing shooters. Whenever I walk into a room that's full of boxes that come up to about here, it's like, yeah, okay, there's lots of cover in this room, so people are going to pile in through the doors at the end. So it puts me in a very different mindset to somebody who just, oh, look, great, that's nice. So yeah, I think it's difficult to design around that. It almost feels like the opposite problem from the previous question, where you've got such a preloaded knowledge that you can anticipate what's going on. And that's why it's really important to disrupt that kind of standard paradigm and the pacing and the layout. I wouldn't be able to give you a specific example of a boss fight that comes out of nowhere, apart from that Deus Ex example that Thomas Grip gave, where you sneak around and then suddenly there's a cutscene. But that's probably a bad example, so I'll stop there. Does that answer your question? A bit, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I was recently talking to someone at a bigger studio, and they were saying a lot of their setups were driven by playtesting and the feedback they were getting. So testers would score it based on how fun it was. And a lot of the design was being changed around because they were getting higher scores in certain setups. Mm-hmm. You know, like, so they were taking out puzzles and whatnot. And so I feel like it could have potentially taken away from the original creative direction. What's your take on that? So you're asking if consistently playtesting and updating your game takes away from the initial creative vision that you had in mind. Yes. So this is an interesting personal point for me, because whilst I think it's super, super crucial to play through your levels, in fact, I liken level design to, hang on, is it level design or playing level design? Yeah, I liken level design to having a kitchen. Right? Your level is like your kitchen. When you're in your own level, you know exactly where the knives and the forks and the spatulas and the spoons are. But when you cook in somebody else's kitchen, it is quite stressful, because you're like, oh, which drawer are the spoons in? I don't know where the pots are, what's going on? And I think you've always got to bear in mind that the player is going to be cooking in your kitchen. So you've got to do the best to make your kitchen kind of conform to a kind of standard layout and not put your cutlery in the bottom drawer, because that's weird. But this always reminds me of this great Alan Moore quote, who says that you shouldn't listen to what anyone says about your design or your critics. You need to be your critic. You need to, because you know when you make something, you know how good or how bad it is. So as long as you approach your initial vision with a really well-balanced type of self-criticism, you should be able to accommodate the feedback you get and filter it out accordingly. I think I've got time for two more questions. 2 minutes left.
I'm curious, out of your entire career, all the levels you designed, what is the one that you're the most proud of or felt was the most successful?
My favorite level that I've designed is the opening level to Medal of Honor Heroes 2, because it's the tutorial level, and it was a very early FPS on Wii, and so we had this mandate to really clearly teach the player the kind of crazy new motion controls of the Wii. But we didn't want to make it like a boring tutorial because it interrupts the flow of the level and it's very dull. And we actually managed to create something that kind of captured the spirit of the Normandy beach landings from the original Medal of Honor. But at the same time, it was a tutorial. So there's loads of explosions that didn't really have much of an effect on the player's health. There were loads and loads of enemies, but they'd shoot at your friends and not at you. But if you move past the enemies would turn around and target you. So it was a really nice tutorial. It felt really exciting. It felt really intense. But it also did a really good job of teaching the player the core mechanics. And every section of the beach landing had been designed very, very deliberately to introduce a new mechanic and to teach the player how to use it. So it was a lot of fun for me to work on as well. So I was quite pleased with that.
Thank you. I'm going to have to check that out.
Yeah, I hope you enjoy it.